Welcome to the Bookman's Corner. I'm your host, Lois Lindstrom. Stay tuned for a scintillating book discussion about dictator Fidel Castro and the end of professional Cuban baseball, written by César Brioso. Welcome to our show,
Thank you for having me.
Our viewers should know you are a former baseball editor for USA Today Sports and have written sports pieces for the Miami Herald and the Sun Sentinel. And you are the author of two well-received books. In your latest book, Last Seasons in Havana, The Castro Revolution and the End of Professional Baseball in Cuba, you explore the intersection between Cuba and America's pastime from the late 1950s to the early 1960s, when Fidel Castro overthrew Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. You take the reader through the revolution in 1959 and its impact on professional baseball immediately following Castro's rise to power. Baseball in pre-Castro Cuba was enjoying a golden age. Unfortunately, professional baseball became one of the many victims of Castro's communist revolution. American players stopped playing in the Cuban League. So what happened to the Cuban professional players?
Well, the final season of the Cuban Winter League was 1960-61, and by that point, U.S.-Cuba relations had ended. The U.S. had stopped diplomatic relations, but Cuban players were allowed to leave to return to the U.S. to play in the majors and the minor leagues. But because they couldn't get visas in Cuba, they had to go through a third country. Most of them went through Mexico. So players like Vidi Mignoso and Camilo Pascual and Pedro Ramos were able to do that to get to the U.S. for spring training and the 1961 season. But then they really had a decision to make. They had to decide to potentially to return to Cuba and risk potentially not being able to leave again and continue to pursue their baseball careers, or decide to stay in the U.S. and maybe not ever set foot on Cuban soil again. Most of them stayed in the U.S. to continue their careers.
But they were able to take their families with them then?
Yes, at that point there was still, they were able to get people out, whether it was when they left immediately for spring training or during the season. Things hadn't completely shut down at that point.
Well, that was good, that was good. Well, your book is fantastic. There's a great history of Cuba. And can you tell us more about what it was like in the 1950s in Cuba with regard to baseball? It was very popular, wasn't it? It
was very popular. Baseball was Cuba's pastime, just as it was here. And every winter you would have multiple American players, major league players, minor league players come and play in the Cuban League. Not only the Cuban-born players, but American players as well. And this was going on for decades. Really. So it was, all the games were played in one stadium in Havana, 4 teams. They all played against each other. It was a very lively experience, especially with the two main rivals, Havana and Almendares of the Cuban League.
Fantastic. Now, César, you were born in Cuba. Tell us about your parents and how they immigrated with you to South Florida. I mean, where did you attend school?
Well, I kind of lived all over the place. We moved to South Florida, then New York and New Jersey, growing up, grade school, high school in Miami, the Hialeah, and then eventually University of Florida. But, once it became clear that the Castro Revolution was turning to communism, my family, my parents decided to leave, and they had their visas and were ready to go, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis hit. And they had been waiting to start a family at that point, hoping to do that when they got to the U.S., but they figured at that point nobody's going to be able to leave the country. I was born in 1965, and then shortly after that another opportunity presented itself with the Camarioca boatlift, and we left. My parents,
what year was that?
1965. I was 5 months old. Okay. It was my parents, my grandparents on my dad's side, and me. Aboard the Skipper K, a 100-foot vessel that the U.S. government leased to start bringing people over from this port.
So it's a very dramatic exit then, yeah. Ooh. And then, and so you lived in several different states,
Yes.
Yeah, interesting. Well, tell us briefly about the research for this book, because it's it has so much history and so much information about baseball. How did you contact the well-known Cuban baseball players from the 1950s?
Well, I'd been a sports writer in Florida for several years, and a lot of these guys were retirees in Florida, and I started finding them for newspaper articles when I was starting my career. And that sort of led me to contacting with other people. At one point, I contacted a writer for El Nuevo Herald in Miami, and he was gracious enough to give me some phone numbers of players.
Great.
And contacting them, I was able to contact other guys.
Yes, yes.
I actually had a former classmate from high school whose dad was a childhood friend of Luis Tiant, and he put me in touch with him, and a radio host, sports radio host down in Miami put me in touch with Pedro Ramos. So just kind of networking and working phone books and stuff.
It's wonderful. It makes it such an interesting read. And it was also interesting to read that following the Spanish-American War, U.S. investments in Cuba exceeded $1.6 billion, and that's in 1898. I couldn't get over that. And I read that in your book. And that also Castro's father had served in the defeated Spanish army in 1898, and his son Fidel Castro was a natural athlete and had developed an interest in baseball. But tell us about Castro's father and his son Fidel as a young teenager.
Well, no doubt that the American investment, both the government and interest, involvement really, the U.S. government and U.S. businesses was huge right after Cuba gained independence. One of those was the United Fruit Company. And Fidel's father, Angel Castro, leased land from the United Fruit Company and as he gained money from that, he kept leasing more land and eventually became a very wealthy landowner. And so Fidel Castro grew up a life of privilege and going to prominent schools, University of Havana, and he was a good athlete, and like most Cuban boys, had an interest in baseball. However, there's sort of this legend that he might have been a major league prospect. That's really very much urban legend. He played pickup baseball just like a lot of Cuban boys.
Okay, and then. That you wrote that of course, the Cuban League was founded in 1878, 2 years after the National Baseball League in the United States, and so basically the people are, baseball is just the sport. Everyone's going to the stadium to watch baseball. What, once a week or something? Is that how it's?
Well, in the early stages, it was brought over to the U.S. by wealthy Cubans who sent their kids to go study in the U.S. in the sort of the 1860s, and it was largely pickup games. Eventually, the league formed. At that point, I believe the first year was like 3 teams.
Okay.
In 1878, and the number of teams in the league varied from year to year until it finally stabilized in the 40s with 4 main teams: Havana, Almendares, Cienfuegos, and Mariel. And yes, for many years they played at a stadium called La Tropical, kind of on the outskirts of the city. And then finally, Bobby Maduro built El Gran Stadium right in the heart of.
So how many people would be attending the game, you think?
Well, a Gran Stadium could hold up to like 35,000 people.
Okay.
La Tropical, which was really more of a multi-purpose, it could accommodate soccer and track. That one held like 20,000.
Cubans were seeking independence from Spain in the mid-1800s, and it was under the leadership of the Cuban named Jose Marti, who used his considerable skills as a journalist, poet, orator, and politician to rally the Cuban people to the cause of independence from Spain. I thought that was interesting in your book. How long did that war last? 3
separate wars, actually. There was the 10 Years' War, that was the first attempt, and there was a very brief, short war called the Little War, and then finally the War for Independence, which Martí was sort of the.
And what year was that?
This was in the 1890s.
Okay, 1890s, okay.
And he really was rallying both the exile community in New York and other places in Florida, because at that point he was in exile. And then he got military in the eastern provinces, and he was actually killed in the very first battle. So he was a martyred hero, but that sort of rallied even more so people to fight for independence. But they didn't actually gain independence until the U.S. Became involved in what now we know as the Spanish-American War. But originally it was just Cuban War for Independence.
Interesting. So it was also very eye-opening to read about how Batista, a former Cuban president, who had been living in Daytona Beach, Florida since leaving office in 1948, decided to get the military of Cuba behind him, and on March 10th, 1952, he declares himself president of Cuba without a shot being fired. I mean, this bloodless coup took 1 hour and 17 minutes. How did the Cuban people react to this?
Well, I think to really understand that, you have to go back to 1933 with Batista. He was one of the people leading the revolt of the sergeants against then Geraldo Machado, the dictator at the time.
Okay.
So he, with that particular revolution, he set himself up as the colonel of the Cuban army, and then kind of the power behind a string of like 6 puppet presidents before finally there was a constitution and he was elected president in 1940. So he did his term and stepped down, and the next person won the presidency, and then the next one, Prio, and he was living in Daytona Beach, got actually elected as a senator in absentia. But it was pretty clear for the 1952 election that he was not going to win. But because he had all these ties with the military, he was able to essentially march into Camp Columbia and just take over.
He just installed himself, right?
Yeah, because he had the backing of the
military.
military.
Yeah.
And Prio basically at that point had to just leave Cuba and went into exile in Miami.
It's incredible. Well, what did Castro do after Batista took power in 1952? I mean, tell us what happened after Castro led a force of approximately 165 rebels on the Cuban army barracks in July of 1953.
Yeah, this was a bold plan and foolish, really, to attack the Moncada barracks in the province of Oriente, in the eastern province. And it failed miserably. Many of them were killed. He and his brother and several others were captured.
And they were sent to prison, right?
Sent to prison on the Isle of Pines.
And they had long terms.
Long terms, although he ended up only serving 2 years because Batista granted amnesty to not just him, but all dissenters of his dictatorship.
Interesting. Now, it was also the fact that it was interesting to read, before Jackie Robinson, only white Cubans had been allowed to play in the majors in the United States, but black Cuban players started to make their debut in the majors during the 1950s. I mean, who were the best known players there?
Well, the big pioneer was Orestes Mini Mignoso. He was the first black Latin American star, and in fact, to Latino players still to this day, he's essentially their Jackie Robinson. He was their pioneer. He played for the Indians, the White Sox. He played in multiple decades because they kept bringing him back as a pinch hitter. So he was such even a cultural icon in Cuba that there was a song, a cha-cha-cha written about him, Mignoso at bate, Mignoso at bat.
Okay, very exciting. Now, I read in your book that Cuba was the first Latin American country to have television and televised baseball games. I mean, what impact did that have on baseball in Cuba?
Oh, it was, you could see it everywhere. And you have to also remember that radio was the main medium at first. And there were multiple radio stations in Havana, and all of them had some sort of coverage of the game. So, but yeah, I think Cuba had the most households in Latin America with television stations at that time.
Yeah, it's very
in terms of broadcast technology, Cuba was at the forefront in Latin America.
Now, let's flip back to when Castro gets out of prison and he heads to Mexico because he's afraid Cuban President Batista will have him killed, and he meets revolutionary Che Guevara in Mexico City. Briefly tell us about their relationship.
Yeah, at that point, he's trying to build an expedition that's going to come and land again in those eastern provinces to start, once again, start a revolution against Batista. And Che Guevara, at that point, he's already been a revolutionary in Latin America, and they meet up, I think, at a party in Mexico, and they find that they have very common interests. And he joins the expedition aboard the Granma, which Che Guevara described when they landed more of a shipwreck than actually a landing. They were overloaded, the ship was. They barely got out onto land, and then were immediately being attacked and had to scurry into the mountains. And only a few of them, I think it was 18, survived of the original expeditionary force.
Ooh. Now, you wrote that during the political unrest in Cuba, Havana experienced a gambling boom which benefited Batista and the government, and of course the American mobsters. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, Batista did all kinds of things in terms of trying to modernize the economy there, controlled by him, and one of the things he wanted to do was make Havana sort of the Riviera of Latin America. and mobsters were already there to some extent, either running or controlling certain casinos.
So there was a big international
hotels.
crowd coming there,
Oh
right?
yeah, it was a cosmopolitan city in the 50s, and casinos was one of the draws for tourists,
Yes,
American
yes,
and
sure.
from elsewhere in the world.
Yeah.
The mobsters, I'm sure paid kickbacks and bribes to
Sure,
Batista and
sure.
other government officials.
Yeah.
Although casinos were a legal business, a legitimate business for them.
Well, I found it interesting that to read that Rivero Aguirre won the presidential election in 1958, but he never took office. Describe how Batista and his cabinet fled Cuba on planes on New Year's Eve with everyone in formal clothes. I mean, did the American press cover this?
Well, it happened in the dead of night, so they had to cover it sort of after the fact.
Yeah.
There was lots of rumors going around. Is Batista going to fall? At this point, the Castro rebels are in full battle against his army in the eastern provinces. There are acts of sabotage and terrorism.
A lot of violence
going on
yeah.
in the city, although the actual fighting is going on elsewhere in the other provinces. But the U.S. had stopped backing Batista in terms of arms. And Rivero Aguirre was elected, kind of a sham election in November of '58. And then on New Year's Eve, Batista knew he was leaving. He had 3 planes set up at Camp Columbia. He invited the leaders, military and government leaders, to a party at his home there. And after the sort of celebration of the new year, he gathered them in his office and basically signed his abdication of the presidency.
Like goodbye.
And said, basically they had to get their stuff, their families, and get aboard those planes, and they left, 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning.
It would really make a great film, wouldn't it? All these people dressed up in tuxedos and long dresses.
Yeah, and it was in the morning when people started to finally realize that it had actually happened. That he had left.
Yeah. So what happened to the American ball players who were living in Cuba after the fall of Batista? What were they thinking?
Well, in the immediate aftermath, there was sort of rioting right there on New Year's Day.
Wow.
People started attacking the casinos and the parking meters, sort of symbols of Batista's corruption. And finally, people involved, the urban underground involved with Castro's revolution, took control, stopped the violence, and essentially there was just a work stoppage, general work stoppage for multiple days. It wasn't until January 8th that Castro came into the city. But so the baseball players were kind of sitting there wondering what to do. There were no games for that first week, and stores were shut down, grocery stores.
They were probably worried.
They were probably worried, but there wasn't really a way to get out at that moment.
Right.
And then slowly things started to return to normal. The games were scheduled as Castro was coming back.
Yeah.
And they were treated as they always had been. Tom Lasorda, Hall of Fame manager for the Dodgers, he was there at the time, and in the Sporting News he was quoted just really defending how well Americans were treated in Cuba, even during that time. So it was scary for them because the stores were closed. They had to try to get food, and there were people walking around the streets with guns, trying to keep people from rioting like they had that first day.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, that was kind of tough reading about the executions of people who had served in the Batista government. I mean, there were 200 executions carried out by mid-January, and some 600 people were imprisoned, and then they killed them. I mean, in front of huge crowds. I mean, it was pretty savage, really.
Yeah, right after Castro took over, once he arrived in Havana, there was a president. Urrutia was the nominal president, but Castro was the prime minister and really running the show. And yeah, they basically started a purge of Batista officials, especially in the military, but government as well, and replacing them with their own people.
And Castro was very clever in forming his government. He changed the law to reduce the required age for Cuban presidents from 35 to 30. That cleared the path for his presidency since he was 32. And he granted Argentinian Che Guevara a native-born status, allowing him to hold political office in Cuba.
Yeah, it was pretty systematic how he got basically kept control. Like I said, there was a nominal president, but he was really the power.
He was in charge.
And they were able to they stopped the Congress was no longer operational.
Yes.
Laws were being changed by edict.
He was the dictator. Yeah.
and it slowly but surely
Yeah.
started to gain full control of Cuba.
Yeah. Well, and then because of weeks of rain in Florida in 1958, several baseball teams decided to switch their games to Cuba. The Dodgers and the Reds would be the last major leagues to plant their spikes on a baseball diamond in Cuba for the next 4 decades. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, it was spring training, and they were experiencing just terrible rains in Florida, and a couple of teams were just trying to figure out how they could just get some work in before the season started. So they set up a couple of exhibition games there, and at this point, there's like soldiers at the games and all that going on.
A lot of armed soldiers walking around.
Yes,
right?
that happened. Sitting in the dugouts, sitting in the stands, walking on the field. But that was the last spring training game played in Cuba, even though they'd had a long history of spring training games there, until the Orioles went there back in the 1998, I think it was.
Yeah. So now, as you mentioned earlier, there was rumors that Castro was possibly a baseball prospect for the league, but that was just a rumor because he just played pickup ball. He wasn't that talented as an athlete, right?
Yeah, it's just one of those things that sort of grew, this legend. It started, I think, pretty innocuously. The scout Joe Cambrier for the Washington Senators, who lived in Cuba and signed 300 to 400 Cuban players over the years, was quoted as saying something like he saw him play and he thought Castro might make the grade in the B minor leagues or something like that. Pretty innocuous, and just every telling afterwards grew. But where it really became sort of ridiculous, Don Houck was a journeyman player, and in a Sport magazine article, he talked about this scene where Castro supposedly came out of the stands in a game and commandeered the mound, took the ball from the pitcher and started pitching before he was dragged off the field. A ludicrous thing which never happened.
It never happened.
And the details in his story make that obvious, aside from just how crazy it was.
Yeah.
He said it happened in 51.
Yeah.
This guy didn't play there in 52.
Exactly, yeah.
Just none of the details match. Castro, when he did play there, was actually in prison. When he said it happened, Batista wasn't in charge of the country at that point. Just complete fabrication, and this legend just kind of grew and was picked up by writers year after year. So.
But it's fascinating. And then the research of what was happening internationally in 1960 and 61 between the United States and Cuba is very impressive. Tell us about that French ship loaded with weapons and ammunition for the Castro government that explodes while docked in Havana, and 100 people die and 300 are injured. And do you think the U.S. government was behind this catastrophe?
I don't know. I certainly didn't find anything to that. That's certainly what Castro was. Anytime that anything bad happened, he would say that it was part of the plot to
take him down,
to dethrone him or whatever.
Yeah.
And when these sorts of events happened, these were the things that really made major league teams skittish about having their players there when they had these acts of violence going on.
And a lot of bombs going on.
And eventually it cost Cuba. Cuba had a AAA team. And they were moved mid-season because of the escalation that was going on and the deterioration between the relationships between the two countries, and eventually the commissioner of baseball denied Americans from going down there to play in 61.
Yes. And then describe the relationship between Castro's government and the Soviet Union in the 1960s.
Well, it just kept getting closer and closer, especially as things got more tense between the U.S. And Cuba.
So they were visiting Soviet ships then, right?
Yeah. Well, one of the part of the thing was that there was Cuba. The U.S. asked the U.S. refineries to stop refining Soviet oil that the Cubans were starting to buy from the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was, of course, all too glad to get in there and help Castro. Yeah. And there hadn't been a relationship between the two countries since Batista had taken over in 52, because he was anti-communist at the time. So now this was their opening, and Castro kept welcoming them, and eventually they developed diplomatic relations as this was all going on.
Right. Now, the big baseball team in Havana was what they call the Sugar Kings, right?
That was the AAA team.
And they were transferred to Jersey City, New Jersey, because they wanted to be sure everyone was safe given all the explosions in Havana, right?
Yeah, that happened in 1960. It was mid-season. The team was on a long road trip in the United States. They played in the International League, so they played teams from Columbus, Ohio, Richmond, Virginia, and so forth. And while they were in the middle of this road trip, the commissioner of the International League finally said, "Okay, we're done. We're moving them to Jersey City," and the move happened so abruptly that when they debuted in Jersey City, they still had their Sugar Kings uniforms.
And you wrote that after Cuba's minor league franchise was revoked in July, American participation in the Cuban League was in doubt, and the Castro regime had seized nearly $1 billion in American property on the island as of August 1960. So it was obviously that the Americans didn't have a chance at that point, right? I mean,
yeah, in many ways, the Cuban Professional League might have been the last vestige of capitalism on the island. The American banks, American oil refineries were seized by the Castro government. Land, I talked about the United Fruit Company, all of these things were eventually expropriated and seized by the government. And that's when, and as all this was happening, that's when Commissioner Ford Frick banned American players from going down there for the 60-61 season, although he allowed Cuban-born players to go back.
And it was also, I thought, very interesting to read about the Operation Peter Pan, because 14,000 children from Cuba were sent to Miami to save them from communist indoctrination. I mean,
this was early on, and
did you know any of those children?
I've met people who have been on that. I didn't grow up with them. We left, like I said, in '65 and afterwards. So this was earlier than that. People, Cubans who could afford this potentially, who already had maybe people here that they could send their kids to. But imagine how difficult that was to put your child on a plane to another country, and then hope that you can get out later. And most of them did, but. That's what they did to try and save their kids.
Yes, but what was amazing was that the parents did eventually were united with the children, right? Well, what are your thoughts on the Bay of Pigs? I know you don't really go into it that much in this book, but what do you think about that situation?
Well, it was disastrous. Both in its planning and I think its execution. They landed in probably the worst place you could possibly land. It was basically mangroves, so there wasn't even a place to establish a beachhead. And essentially the Castro's army was there waiting for them. Many were killed, others were captured. And because of this, it really was kind of a boon for him, like in the sense of people rallied around, the Cuban people rallied around them because of this failed attack in the immediate aftermath of that. So yeah, it was just a disaster all the way around.
Now, what do you think about the future of Cuba? I mean, do you think is it positive? Is it neutral? Is it depressing? What is it?
It's so hard to know. Right now, for the first time, someone not named Castro is president in decades, but nothing has really changed in the sense. Raul Castro, Fidel's younger brother, who became president after he died.
He died in 2018, right?
Yeah. And he stepped aside, but I think he's still head of the Communist Party, so he's still, in a sense, running. But everybody there, all of the hierarchy of the government, they're communists. So. When will that change? Who knows? They've allowed sort of individual entrepreneurship here and there,
yes.
But even that is minute compared to sort of the burgeoning capitalism that was there before the revolution.
Well, Cesar, I wish we had more time to talk more about this wonderful book. It was so enlightening, and I hope people rush out and get it. And I just want to ask you, where can our viewers find your book to purchase it?
The easiest place is online. You can get it at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and also University of Nebraska Press.
Well, thank you so much again for being with us.
Thank you.
And it's been wonderful, and I hope that many people will get your book and learn more about Cuba. And thanks for watching. Please join us again next month for a new edition of the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom.